Our next reading is overview of equity securities, and these are the specific learning outcome statements. What are the key areas in this reading? Equity risk and return, why equity has more risk than bonds, loans. Characteristics of common and preferred stock, types of common and preferred stock, methods of investing in foreign stock, and finally, the difference in book value or between book value and the market value of equity. So these are the key areas to be done in this specific reading. Let's do first one, describe characteristics of types of equity securities. First, common shares. This is the well-known type of investment in listed organization. Common share means ownership interest in a business. If you purchase common shares in any entity, you are buying ownership interest in that entity. In other words, if we look at the accounting equation, assets is equal to liabilities plus equity. And if you deduct all the liabilities, long-term and current, from the total assets, what remains is called the residual interest or residual claim. So common shares represent ownership interest, and they are the owners of residual interest. All the liabilities, if settled out, whatever remains belongs to the common shareholders. That's the first characteristic you need to know. Since common shareholders are the owners, they have the voting rights. Since shareholders could be millions in number, and yes, they are the owners, they are quite large in number, so not all of them and not all can control the business. They appoint professional managers, directors to run the business on their behalf, and this is done through selecting directors via voting rights. So common shareholders have voting rights. They use their voting rights to select individuals who will run the business on their behalf. That's what you already know, you're already familiar with. It's called the divorce between ownership and control. Owners are the shareholders, who could be millions in number, and the control is exercised by the directors voted in by the shareholders. That's the important characteristic to remember. Feature of common shares. Remember, if you purchase common shares in any organization, company is under no obligation to pay you dividends. I purchased few hundred shares in a company 12 years ago, and I have not received even a single rupee as a dividend. Company has no obligation to pay me dividend. I have no redress. I cannot write letters to SEC or the stock exchanges demanding the dividends, because payment of dividends is no obligation for listed organization. There is no obligation. When you purchase shares in an organization, you have taken on the risk. So do not expect return. What did I get in the last 12 years? Just few shares given as bonus shares. No dividend, not even a single dime. So I knew that when I bought these shares, because it's a risk capital, maybe I won't get anything. Maybe the whole investment might be lost. So that's what's specifically associated with common shares. So what common shares give you? Ownership interest, and this ownership interest is exercised through voting right. You use your voting right, you get the directors on the board, and those directors will protect your interest. Sometimes voting right may be exercised through proxies. Who are proxies? Shareholders who may exercise your voting right under the power of attorney. You can authorize them to use let's say there's a shareholder A, and he's being appointed as a proxy of shareholder B, C, D. A has a shareholding of 3%, for example. B, C, D, under an agreement, they authorize A to exercise their voting right through A. Let's say A has a holding of 5, C has a holding of 2, and D has a holding of 3. So total of 10% holding. So 10% voting right of BCD plus 3% A. So A can exercise a total of 13% votes in the election of directors. This is called proxy. You can authorize an individual, a shareholder, who will exercise your votings on your behalf. Voting can be done in two ways. First, statutory voting. Statutory voting means each share has one vote. Let's say I'm an investor and I have 100 votes in an organization, and there are 3 appointments of directors. There are 3 slots to be filled by directors. Under statutory voting, I can use my 100 votes for the director A, B, and C. In these 3 different selections, I can use my 100 votes for A, 100 votes for B, 100 votes for C. Right? This is statutory voting. Now, these are the 3 locations. Remember, these are the 3 slots A, B, C. There may be more directors. So I can use my 100 votes in these 3 slots A, B, C. Under cumulative voting, 100 multiplied by 3, I will have total 300 votes, and I can cast all these votes for slot A, the director of my choice. This is cumulative voting. In cumulative voting, I can cast all my votes to a single position, thereby giving me a significant leverage to appoint individuals of our choice. This voting type is specifically favorable for minority interest. What is a minority or non-controlling interest? Let's say if a company represents this pie chart, and this represents the majority holding of 80%, remaining 20% who do not control the business, they are called minority interest and now non-controlling interest. This is the new term being used. Originally it was used minority interest. It's non-controlling interest. So non-controlling interest can, under cumulative voting, can cast a majority of the votes for single or 1 or 2 slots for directors. So cumulative voting goes in favor for minority or non-controlling interest. Then next type of shares are preference shares. Preference shares, also called preferred stock, it's a hybrid instrument. It's a hybrid instrument that contains the features of common stock as well as debt. How come? For preferred stock, the dividend is a fixed amount. Like debt, debt also carries fixed interest payment. So like debt, preferred shares typically make fixed periodic payment. So that gives it the feature of debts. And at the same time, payment of dividend is not an obligation. Like in common shares, payment of dividend, I just told you, I have investment and it didn't pay me anything for the last 12 years because payment of dividend is no obligation. The organization, the listed company, is under no obligation to pay dividend. Same is true for preference shares. Dividend payment is not an obligation. So preference shares have the feature of common stock. The dividend payment is not an obligation. At the same time, the dividend payment is fixed. That's why it's called a hybrid instrument. It has features of both common stock and debt. Now, if the preference shares are cumulative, if the company didn't pay dividend in year 1, it did not pay dividend in year 2, fixed dividend. But in the 3rd year, if the profits are sizable, all the dividends in arrears must be paid in the 3rd year before the dividend to the common stockholder is paid. That is cumulative. All the prior year dividends will be paid. But if it is non-cumulative preferred stock, it means if the company declares, the directors declare the dividend in year 1, well and good. If no dividend declared, this year 1 dividend will never be paid. If there is no dividend in year 2, won't be paid ever. Yes, if the company has earned profit in 3rd year, then only you will get the dividend, a fixed amount only for 3rd year, no dividend for the prior year. This is non-cumulative. Then participating versus non-participating preference shares. Participating preference shares mean that if company earns a certain profit above a certain limit, then preference shareholders will not only get their regular fixed dividends, but they will also participate in the sizable profits the company has earned. Such shares are called participating preference shares. If they are non-participating, it means they will simply get the fixed dividend that, like for example, if a preference shares has a power of $100 and the dividend is 8%, you will simply get $8 as dividend. No participation in profit. But in case of participating, if there is a sizable profit beyond a certain limit, then preference shares will get the regular dividend as well as some participation in the profits. Next is convertibility. Some preference shares might be convertible into common shares. Now, why would a company issue such shares? Convertible preference shares, convertible into common shares. Why? In order to make preference shares more attractive. Preference shares not only will get you fixed dividend, but also after a specific date, a specific time period, those preference shares will be converted to common shares. So they will give you the ownership right as well. Not only that, convertible preference shares will also carry higher dividend. It will carry higher dividend, which is normally fixed payment that is made every year if the directors declare. So this convertibility option is favorable for the investors. So it is at the option of the investors whenever they find it convenient, whenever the market price is high. Let's say the market price for the share is $30, but under the contract with the company, the convertibility option gives you the right to purchase these shares at $10. This is much more valuable option. You can purchase the share at $10, which is currently trading at $30. So convertibility will make the preference shares more attractive. Investors can make benefit of upside potential when the market price goes up. You can purchase. Otherwise, it's at the option. It's not compulsory or mandatory that you exercise the option. If you find the market price to be low, market price is hovering somewhere around $7, why would you exercise the right to preference shares when the market price is low? Then, some other features of common shares. Next reading, your reading 2 says, describe differences in voting rights and other ownership characteristics among different equity classes. In India and Pakistan, we have, like in Pakistan, I'm for sure, in Pakistan, we have just simple straight common stock. No classes of shares in Pakistan. Yes, denomination could be 10 rupees, 100 rupees, 1000 rupees, but they are all the same. There are no classes. But in the US, firms are allowed or authorized to issue different classes of common stock. Class A, Class B. So what is the distinction? What's the distinction between Class A and B? They might differ with regard to dividend payments. Maybe Class A dividends will get more dividend, Class B will get less dividend. They might differ with regard to probably stock splits, that A might be splitted, B may not be splitted, or maybe B splitted and differently, A splitted differently. So they will have some different features from each other. So as an analyst, how do I know what are the specific features of Class A common shares and Class B common shares? It is found in the company's corporate charter. Like we have in Pakistan and India, we have articles of association and memorandum of association. These are the documents drawn up for getting the company registered and listed. So in the US, they have corporate charter, and that charter contains the details, features of different classes of shares. Articles of association contains how the votings would be conducted. Cumulative, non-cumulative, statutory voting. Similarly, the corporate charter will contain the methods of conducting meetings and votings. So these are very important documents in our corporate world. There they call it corporate charter, but in our part of the world, we'll call it AO and MOA. MOA being the supreme document. It is relatively shorter in length. It could be about 5 to 6 page And this could be an extensive document from 30 to 40 pages, and they are both bound up in a single volume and submitted to the board of, in the US, it is SECP, SEC, in Pakistan, SECP, in India, it's SEBI, Securities Exchange Board of India. So these are the regulators, and to such regulating authorities, we submit the documents containing our internal working, corporate charters, AOA, MOAs, and other regulatory filing. So we can come to know about different features of A and B, Class A, Class B, through the documents submitted to the Securities Exchange Commission. Class of Common, and of course regulatory filing will let you know regarding the features of these different types of equity securities. Next reading, distinguish between public and private equity securities. So far we have discussed public securities, publicly traded securities, preferred stock and common stock. When we say private equity is usually issued to institutional investors via private placement. Public issue means stock exchange is involved, banks are involved, investment bankers are involved, regulators are involved. But in private equity, there might be no involvement of regulators. It's a private deal between the issuer. A Incorporated is the issuer, and a certain slice of the shares, let's say 20%, are being offered privately to an investor X Incorporated, for example. It could be a wealthy individual, may not be a corporate investor. So 20% stake in A has been privately sold to another investor X Incorporated. Such as sale of stock privately is called private placement. But there are certain drawbacks of such. There are certain advantages as well. Rather than bypassing the regular stock market, why would a company go for private placement? Why? There are certain advantages and disadvantages. So every decision involving business context always involves cost versus benefit. Cost benefit analysis. Why do we select private placement rather than not going to the regular market for share issue? So there has to be certain reason. So private equity involves sale of companies, specific percentage of shares privately to institutional investors. This market is relatively small, of course. You have to find individually one-to-one based transaction. So its market is small, but it is rapidly growing with the passage of time. So there are certain characteristics that we need to discuss. Features of private equity. The first feature, it is less liquid. It's one-on-one transaction, so there is less liquidity. Second feature is that the price agreed between A and B may not be determined by the market, because in the market the prices of shares are determined through sources of demand and supply. But in private equity, since it's one-on-one transaction, so the prices that A and B agree on, the price is not determined by the market. That's an important feature. Third, since it's a private placement, regulators have very limited role to play, sometimes no role at all. So there is no regulation involved. It's one-on-one transaction where a company is selling a certain stake to a certain private individual. So limited financial disclosure, no regulation or very little regulation involved in this transaction. And further, for such placement, there might be weaker corporate governance, because corporate governance are applicable for public issue where the public interest needs protection. But this transaction is one-on-one based transaction, so the regulations are quite limited in this regard. So there is weaker corporate governance because there is a reduced reporting requirement and there is less scrutinization, less public scrutiny. So these are important features. Since it's a one-on-one transaction, so there is basically no public pressure, no pressure from other shareholders. So these are specific features of private placement. There are basically three types of private equity: venture capital, leveraged buyout, management buyout, and private investments called PIPE. We'll discuss these one by one. First of all, discuss venture capital. Venture capital refers to the capital provided by wealthy individuals, by hedge funds. Normally, let's say I start a new setup, FTC Incorporated, and it could be a risky venture. I go to the bank straight away refuse me any funding because they do not believe upon the radical idea that I offered them. So I resort to some wealthy individuals, some hedge funds, and I offer my idea to them. So they're willing to provide me the necessary startup capital, the seed capital. So venture capital are investors who are willing to invest for the early startup of a business, and that business is unable to obtain finance from the regular banking channels. The problem for the venture capitalist is that he is taking a great risk. Maybe it takes probably 5 to 10 years before he might make some return on his investment. So he will be literally tied up in the investment unless the business starts functioning. So he's taking a great risk. There is technically no liquidity. When he puts the money in the business, he can't exit from this arrangement because the business is not be generating cash immediately. It will take time. There's some gestation period, and after some time when the revenues start coming in, the expenses are covered, then the profits are earned. So the venture capitalists will have to wait for a longer period of time before the firm starts generating some money, or when it becomes a stable organization, it might go for an IPO, and through IPO then the venture capitalist may gain some reward for his investment. He can sell it at a sizable investment later on. Next, leveraged buyout or management buyout. Let's say there's a company A Incorporated, and I want to buy this company out completely. What I do, I put, let's say this company's valuation is 50 million. Out of this 50 million, 20% of this money is invested by me as my equity, and remaining 80%, that is 40 million, comes from different sources of loans, debt financing. So this is a buyout, but it's a leveraged one. Leveraged one means the transaction has been funded through debt. It's called a leveraged buyout. Investor, me, I buy all the firm's equity using some of my equity, but most of it has come from debt financing, leverage. Okay, so this is called leverage buyout. But if the same thing happens when the existing management, let's say A Incorporated is a business, when the management of A Incorporated does this thing, they use 20% of their savings and they borrow 80% from different sources, and they buy the business they were employed with. They buy their own company, the managers gain sufficient funds, and they use this money to buy the business they were working in. This is called management buyout. Then third, private equity is PIPE. Private investment in public equity. What does it mean? A firm needs funding quickly. What firm can do? Firm can sell a slice of its equity to private individuals. That is private investment in public equity. It's a public listed company, but as part of its equity has been sold to private individuals. Why would an investor bypass the market and buy this slice outside the market in a private transaction? Probably the market price, I'm giving the exact practical example, way back in 2008 when one of our banks was getting into such a private transaction. The price they agreed upon was about 350 rupees per share, whereas at that time the share price was over 400 rupees. See, so the investor in this arrangement can purchase the share at a sizable discount than the market. The price was 400 in the market. He bought the share at 350, 20% stake in that company. This is private investment in public equity. All these are examples of private equity. So that completes your reading 3. Moving on to the next one. Describe methods for investing in non-domestic equity securities. First, the concept is integrated market. What is the idea behind integrated market? The world has changed over the last 15 to 20 years. Technology, improvement in communication channels, ease of capital movement from one place to another. So markets now have become more integrated. So when we say money can freely flow across borders, we say the market is integrated, connected. Different countries connected through some maybe Eurozone region, ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries. So money can flow easily between these countries. Investor in country A can put his money in country B, and so on. The money can easily flow across the border. We say the markets are integrated. This has happened because of improvement in technologies, in communication systems. Banking system have improved over the period. So that's why it has become quite easy for the firms to obtain international funding, international finance for their equity investments. Despite the rapid integration in the markets, still there are many barriers. Still we find the capital to flow from one country to another. There are certain barriers deliberately erected by the government to protect the local economy or for some any other reason. So integrated market means the capital flows freely between the countries, where investors can take positions in country A and B and C, simultaneously dispose it off in D, and so on. So these are the ways we can invest in non-domestic equity market. Direct investment. Let's say if I want to purchase, Tesla is going to be added in S&P 500 by December 2021, and yesterday's price was $368 per share. So many auto specialists, analysts, they have predicted the price to go beyond $450 per share. And over the last 12 months, Tesla share has grown up more than 500%. Tesla valuation is now equal to the top 7 automakers in Japan. Tesla valuation is now greater than top 7 automakers in Japan. And what Toyota CEO says, he says Tesla is not a real company. Tesla is not a real company. That is what I can say is just denial. Denying the truth. So the point is, if I want to invest in Tesla, it's a US based firm, I can either make a direct investment by purchasing Tesla stock through a broker who allows me to make international investment from within Pakistan, or maybe I can open some account with the US broker and I transfer him funds and he can purchase my share in Tesla. So either he can do this way, or there are some other ways as well. Let us discuss them. Next way we have our ADRs and GDRs. Now let us discuss these, what they are. What we are doing, we are studying described methods of investing in non-domestic equity markets. So one is direct investment. We just discussed direct investment means I can simply invest directly in the company by purchasing a share. Other way for me is through ADRs and GDR. What are ADRs and GDRs? Let us discuss them one by one. GDR stands for Global Depository Receipts. ADR stands for American Depository Receipts. So what's the difference between these? Then we have GRSs as well. We'll discuss these one by one. GDRs, called Global Depository Receipts. Let's say if someone in the US wants to invest in a bank in Pakistan, HBL. HBL is one of the largest banks in Pakistan. But unfortunately, HBL is listed in Pakistan. It's a listed company. It's a bank, at the same time it's a listed company. Let's take some other name so as not to confuse, because there is another depository bank involved. Let us consider ABC Limited. It's a sizable company in Pakistan, for example. Someone in the US wants to invest in this company, ABC Limited. Many investors in the US want to invest in ABC. So what can be done? Some American depository bank can purchase ABC Limited shares and issue ADRs. In the US, it's called ADRs, American Depository Receipts. Some American depository bank purchase ABC Limited shares and it issues ADRs to the investors in the US. ADRs are American Depository Receipts. So the depositor bank will purchase, he will act as a custodian. He will buy the shares and will issue the ADRs to those in the US who wants to make investment in ABC Limited. But if such an arrangement is done outside US, let's say in England, for example, if someone to do the same thing in England, a depository bank buys ABC stock and issues evidences or investments in such a stock, such investment is evidenced through GDRs. So the dynamics are the same. In the US, it's called ADR. Outside the US, it's called GDR. Custodian banks will take in the specific number of foreign shares, and in return, it will issue its own ADRs in the US and GDRs outside the US. So this way, foreigners can invest in those shares that are not listed in the local exchanges. Such GDRs and ADRs may be listed within the US, so the investors can invest directly in these ADRs and GDRs. Then we have global deposit, next is GRS. That is global registered shares. This is little different than GDRs and ADRs. Global registered shares are traded in different currencies, like ADRs are in dollars, GDRs are in dollars. GDR listed even in England are in dollars. GRS are in the local exchanges. Let's say a certain block of shares, it is listed in Luxembourg and it might be listed in the local currency. Global registered shares are traded in different currencies on stock exchanges around the world in the local currency that representing in the economy in which they are being traded. Whereas ADRs and GDRs are denominated in dollar. So this is how foreign investors can make investment in foreign companies, either via direct investment or through ADRs or GDRs through a depository bank, and they might then be facing different types of risks and returns. For example, if the price goes up, GDR, like in let's say HBL in Pakistan, if because of expansion, increase in earning, if HBL share price goes up, the GDR will go up. But if because of downturn economic circumstances, HBL price fall, the GDR will result in losses as well. Dividend payments, price changes, economic variables that change in the main parent company, it will also affect the GDR price accordingly. And it will also, if the exchange rate between rupees and dollars, if there is exchange rate volatility, the return on GDR will also vary with the changes in exchange rates. Alright, next we have types of ADR. Yes, this is important to be discussed. There are 4 types of ADRs in the US: level 1, level 2, level 3 and rule 144A. Let us discuss these one by one. Level 1 ADR, it is traded on over the counter in the dealer market. Such ADRs will not raise any capital. We are talking about HBL, for example. HBL investment made by the US nationals through ADRs. If it's level 1 ADR, issuance of such ADRs will not raise any capital for the HBL company. Is SEC registration required? Yes. You need SEC registration before such ADRs are issued in the US. Listing expenses are low. So the US nationals can buy and sell such ADRs over the counter in the dealer market. Level 2 ADRs, trading location, regular stock exchanges, New York Stock Exchange, NADEX and your auction markets. SEC registration required? Yes. Such ADRs, when issued by the depository bank, of course they will not result in any inflow for the HBL, because they are just, these shares have been bought by the depository company, the depository bank, and they have issued ADRs to the local investors in the US. It will require SEC registration, yes, but in such a case again no money would be received by HBL, the parent company. Since it's an auction market, so the listing fee would be high. listing expenses would be more. The third, level 3 ADRs, the regular auction market. SEC registration required, yes, but this level 3 ADR, it will be sponsored. It's not the sponsored one. This is the sponsored. HBL, if issues ADRs under level 3, in this case, if ADRs are sold, the money would be received by HBL. In this case, there was no capital raised by HBL, but in this case, yes. Listing expenses high, yes. And the last one, Rule 144. Under Rule 144, if HBL issues ADR, it is done through a private arrangement when there is no exchange involved. Since there is no exchange involved, no public interest is in question, so there is no SEC registration required. Ability to raise capital, if HBL sells its ADR in the US under Rule 144A, yes, HBL will receive money. This is the sponsored issue. And listing expenses in the private arrangement is low. Likewise, apart from this topic ADR, remember in the US, whenever a listed company, let's say Tesla Motors, Tesla Incorporated, if they have to issue shares, every time the shares are issued, a registration statement is to be filed with SEC. Every time you do it. But in case if if Tesla Incorporated wants to make a private placement of its shares, no such registration statement is required under Section 504 of Securities Act. Private placement can be made directly without getting any registration statement from SEC. Similarly, this Rule 144 private placement does not require any SEC registration. So this way, the foreign investors can invest directly in the foreign companies. Next LOS is compare the risk and return characteristic of different types of equity securities. Return on equity securities. Let's say I purchased an equity security for $100. And remember, I am in Pakistan where the currency is PKR. All right. Right now, $1 is about equal to 160 rupees. Okay. Now, if I've made an investment of $100 in the US stock, this $100 has gone up by the end of the year to $110. At the same time, I have also received $5 dividend. So my total gain appears to be $15. But if in the meanwhile, if the dollar exchange rate against rupee changes, the dollar may go up or may go down. It might affect my profits. My return could be influenced by exchange rate gains and loss. If the US dollar strengthens against the Pakistani rupee, my gain will go up. And if the US dollar depreciates against Pakistani currency, then it will result in a loss for me. So remember, in case of foreign investment, the gain could come because of capital gain. The price goes up 100 to 110. You might receive a dividend from the company in which whose securities you have invested, and there might be some foreign exchange gain and loss. So combine these will give you the overall return on your investment. Okay, now how the equity risk is measured. Equity risk is measured through volatility in returns. Standard deviation of returns. Remind you, it is not the standard deviation of dividends, it is the standard deviation of return. Dividend is what is paid out of the earnings, out of the returns. Standard deviation of returns is how we measure the risk of an equity. An equity that has more volatility, share price, and the returns are highly volatile from one period to another, we say that this is a highly risky investment. But if the price tends to stabilize and the returns are consistent from year after year, so the risk is low. Now, let us compare risk-wise common stock versus preferred stock. As an investor, I want to see it from the point of view of being an investor. Common stock versus preferred stock. Preferred stock carry fixed amount of dividend, 10% for example. Common stock dividends are variable. Because of the variability of the dividends against the preferred stock, make common stock riskier investment. So as an investor, I find common stock to be more riskier than preferred stock. Why? Because common stock's returns are volatile. There is volatility in returns. Preferred stock dividend is fixed. Cumulative versus non-cumulative. Cumulative means if I do not get dividend in year 1, 2 or 3, I will get all the prior year's dividend in arrears in year 4. But in non-cumulative dividend means if the dividend is not declared or paid in year 1, 2, I won't get this dividend ever in the future. So with regard to cumulative versus non-cumulative, we find non-cumulative to be more riskier because you might lose on many years on dividends, right? So risk on non-cumulative, preferred stock is more than non-cumulative. Then puttable shares versus callable shares. Now what's the difference between these? Let's say a company issues callable shares. Callable shares mean that company can buy these shares back after a stated period of time. Callable shares are the shares that the firm can call back after a stated period of time. And puttable shares, these are the shares which at the option of the investor can be put back for the company. You can put it back, you can return this share back to the company. Now, which of these are more riskier? Callable shares, the control is in the hands of the company. Company can call the shares back after a stated period of time. So it means they control it. We as an investor, we don't. Whereas puttable shares are this is in control of the firm. They can call the shares back. And puttable shares are in your hand, so you can put them back to the firm from whom you bought it. So this is in control of the investor. Since you exercise control for puttable shares, it means for callable share, the risk would be higher. Puttable shares, whenever you find that the market price has gone down, so you can put the shares back to the original issuer. So it means puttable versus callable shares are riskier than puttable shares. Preferred shares are safer, common stock is riskier. Non-cumulative is riskier. And here, the callable shares are riskier. Next, explain the role of equity securities in financing of company needs, company's assets. Use of company, when you issue shares, what could be the purpose for share issuance? The company might be planning for capital expenditure, long-term investments, investment in long-lived assets, equipment, plant and machinery, developing some physical facilities for production, research and development, probably expansion into new geographical regions, market expansion, acquisition. If you just need to ensure the going concern, or maybe you just need to improve your liquidity, this is not the right thing to do. Go for the bank loan. So these are the prime reasons why a firm will go for listing, for equity capital. Long-term needs of the funds will require issue of shares, because share issue is a long-term source of finance, and that is used for long-term capital investments, market expansions, acquisitions, so on and so forth. And of course, issuing shares will improve your liquidity ratios, your solvency ratios. But remember, for short-term refinancing needs, we might go to the bank for lines of credit, for term loan, for overdrafts. But for long-term fundings, for long-term arrangements, we go for share issue. Distinguish between the market value and the book value of an equity. Book value of equity can be calculated by deducting your liabilities from assets. This is what we discussed at the start. If you deduct all the liabilities from all the assets, what you get, sometimes it's called the net assets, sometimes it's called equity or simply book value of equity. Because let's say if your business has $100,000 worth of assets and we have $40,000 of total liabilities, current and non-current, so the net amount 60,000 represents the book value of your assets, or book value of your equity. Book value of equity, not assets. Or residual interest. Just like our assets do not exist in a single account, within the non-current category, long-lived asset, we have property, plant and equipment. Current asset might be stock, cash, bank, account receivables, marketable securities. Your equity doesn't exist in a single account. Equity could exist in common stock, additional paid in capital, retained earnings, other comprehensive income, dividend equalization reserve, capital redemption reserve, any other capital and revenue reserve. So equity exists in different accounts. Total of these, as you might have seen in the statement of changes in equity, is the book value of equity. Whereas market value is determined by the market, by the forces of demand and supply in the market. Book value can be influenced by the income. If your income goes up and you do not pay dividend, this income will eventually become the part of your equity, and equity is the book value of equity. Whereas the market value depends upon investors' perception of risk and expected returns, and the price of your stock keeps on going up depending upon many fundamental factors. Book value affects share issues. When you issue shares, equity will go up. When you issue shares at in excess of the par value, like $10 share could be sold for 150, for example. The difference is 140, which is called share premium in our part of the world, but it is called extra, or what you call the excess, or what you call additional contributed capital, sometimes called additional paid in capital, or sometimes called the amount collected in excess of par. So all of this, when you issue the shares at premium, it will become a part of your equity, and it is reflected in the statement of changes in equity. And when you distribute your earnings, earnings are paid out of equity, because any dividend to be paid, whether it's a cash dividend, it's a property dividend, or stock split in the form of dividend, it is paid out of retained earning, and retained earning is equity. So distribution of earnings can lower your equity. Market value, it is not related to book value. Market value is determined by the investor's perception of risk, expected return, as well as the fundamentals, the economic circumstances, so on and so forth. Finally, the last reading, compare company's cost of equity, return on equity, and investors' required rate of return. First of all, accounting return or equity is simply ROE, net income, divided by average equity. This is how we can calculate a return on equity or accounting a return on equity. Why do we need to take average in the denominator, net income upon average equity? The reason is net income has been driven from your income statement, which is for a period from Jan to December. So in order to make things comparable, equity is averaged opening equity plus closing equity. This is the one reason why do we need to take the average equity. The second reason is that equity might involve certain changes over the period. So in order to level out the volatility in equity, we add opening and closing and we divide it with 2. But if there isn't such volatility in equity, we can take the opening equity as well. So net income upon average equity is the measure of return on equity, that how much equity has generated for the business has generated for the investors, for equity holders. Call it. Sometimes you might use opening equity if there is no volatility, but ideally, if you have been given opening and closing, you should use average equity. Okay, effects on return on equity if share issue versus share buyback. How does it affect return on equity? If the firm has issued share issue will increase your equity. When equity goes up, net income upon equity, since being in denominator, will lower the return on equity. Speaking in the reverse order, if the company purchases its own stock, company issue bonds, and the bond proceeds are used to buy your own stock from the market, buying your own stock from the market will lower your equity. Resultantly, lowered equity means lower denominator will increase your return on equity. So remember, whenever you are commenting or you want to assess the impact on return on equity, you need to see the numerator and denominator both in comparison to each other, how they both interplay and how they together affect the ratio, whether it goes up or down. You can see, like for example, your current net income is $10,000 and your average equity is, let's say, $100,000, right? Now, if the question says if income goes up by 5% and your equity goes up by 5%, how do you see the ratio to fall or increase? Now, 5% of 10,000 will be just 10,500. But 5% of 100,000 would be 5,000. That will be 1 of 5,000. So as you can see, the denominator has become even bigger, so the ratio will fall. So you need to see, by substituting the numbers, you do not jump at the options. You need to see how these percentages can influence numerator and denominator, and how it can then, you can then give the exact response. Right? As I said, the firm can issue shares or buy its own share by issuing debt, so it can affect the equity. You need to see the impact upon numerator, denominator, and then give your comment whether the ROE would improve or deteriorate. Then there's another important measure we use is called market price per share upon book value per share, market to book ratio, price to book ratio sometimes called. It's market price per share upon book value per share. Market price per share, it is readily available from the market. Let's say currently a share is trading at $50. Book value per share can be calculated by dividing your total equity with the number of shares. Let's say the equity as per our books is $100,000, and how many shares are there? Let's say the number of shares issued are 2,000, or let's take it 20,000, right? If you cancel it out, what you get is the book value per share means equity divided on the number of shares, it is $5. So market price per share is 50, whereas equity in the books, if it is calculated or based upon the total number of shares, it's just 5. So as per the books, each share is worth $5, but the market is valuing it at $50. So it means it is operating at 10 times of your book value. A share that is in the books for $5 is trading at $50. Why is it so? There are two reasons. Number one, in the US, long-lived assets are not allowed to be revalued. You can't revalue long-lived assets. They have to be reported at their original historical costs. Resultantly, there is no revaluation reserve. Hence, the equity is suppressed, understated. Market will not consider these long-lived assets at original historical cost. Market will value these long-lived assets at their current prices. Resultantly, they will value the firm higher. Whereas in the books, the long-lived assets are understated because of their historical costs. So this is one of the reasons why there is a difference, such a difference between the market price and the book price, book value of the share. Other reason could be that the market is viewing this company, maybe it's a new company, just recently formed a couple of years ago, then the long-lived assets are just new. So there is not such an old cost that is outdated and understated. But still we have this number 50 by 5. So what does it mean? Market is very optimistic about this firm. The firm has a huge growth potential, so it could perform very well in the future. So high market to book ratio represents that the firm has the potential to do well. It's a growth stock. It's a growth stock. High price to book ratio means it's a growth stock. But if it's low, then it is considered as a value stock, and I'm sure you would have got these basic understandings from your prior readings. And I guess that completes your reading number 8. Do we have anything left out? Company's cost of equity. Cost of equity is basically the investor's desired rate of return. What the investor expects from the company's investments, keeping in mind the risk as well. So, and what else? We've calculated return on equity and required rates of return. Let's say if the share price is increasing, investor would get compensated from capital gains, so his required rate of return will fall. Conversely speaking, if the share price is showing a downward trend, in order to compensate for the risk of decrease in price, losses, low capital gains or losses, the required rate of return will go up. So the rate of return is linked with the share price. The price is expected to go up, required rate of return will be low, and vice versa. And at the same time, if there is more volatility expected in the returns, then in that case, the required rate of return would also go up. So these are the basic concepts you would have gone through in your prior readings. So that completes your reading overview for equity securities.